Hi, everybody. How y'all doing tonight? Anybody got big plans for the 4th? I'm doing good. Very hot here, but I guess that's normal because it's July, so probably be weird if it wasn't. Oh, that'll be fun. I'm just going to have some friends over and do some hot dogs and watch some movies. But I'm going to get going because I know you guys probably have other things you'd like to do. So I think I'm going to go ahead and get started here. So this will kind of be like our last lecture. I will give you some time at the end to ask some questions if anybody has anything. And I'm going to spend the first little time here going over the last couple assignments for the class. And then I'm going to get into some content stuff. So anybody have any questions before we get started? Everybody okay with stuff? Everybody's audio and visual working okay? Seems like it is. I think I'll go ahead and get going then. Get my little glasses on here so I look like John Lim. Cool. Okay, let's get moving here. So let's talk about these last couple assignments. Now, a couple of you have already turned these in, and they were really good. So I know it's obvious you know how to do this, but I'm just going to go over this for people that are going to be doing this soon. So the next one you're going to do is the Unit 7 assignment. And the Unit 7 assignment is kind of your big writing assignment for the course. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to select one of those 7 events there that I have listed. And you need to decide which one you want to do. Then you need to kind of make a scholarly argument as to why you think that particular event that you chose was a primary cause of the Civil War. Okay? Now, of course, nobody knows for sure exactly what, was the absolute cause of the Civil War, so they really can't get it wrong. You just need to make a persuasive argument about the event that you chose and write a paper about it. And if you don't, really know about all those events, what I would advise you to do before you start is to go through all the unit study guide because it's going to have information about all those things. And then you can kind of decide if one of them sticks out more to you than the others. Maybe you might be interested in one more than the others. So this needs to use 3 sources. They need to be peer-reviewed or academic sources, and 2 of them need to come from our CSU online library. So if you haven't, been to the CSU library yet, I really encourage you to take a look at it. It's pretty easy to use. It's pretty user-friendly, and they have tons and tons of resources you can use. So then you pick one of these events, and you analyze it. And what you need to do in your paper, basically what I tell people, kind of pretend that you're writing this for somebody who doesn't know anything about it at all. So analyze the event, provide just basic information about it. What was it? What happened? Talk about the different social, political, and economic issues tied to it. And basically just kind of talk about why you think that particular event was, really a big causative factor for the Civil War. And I think it's important to always tell people too, any kind of research paper you do in anything, always try to meet these 5 W's in your research writing and answer these questions of who, what, where, when, and why. And if you kind of approach your paper that way, you'll do good. So your citations need to use APA citation style, and there's an announcement on our course site that I put up there with some examples of the APA style that you can take a look at. It's not very difficult. And if you go to our actual syllabus, this is actually cut and pasted right from our class syllabus. These are links. You can't cut and paste them. But if you go to the syllabus, there are actually clickable links here where you can go right to these academic databases and take a look at them. So you really shouldn't have too much trouble trying to find your sources and stuff. But if you have any questions, you can always email me. If you have trouble writing, if writing a research paper is challenging for you, I would really recommend contacting the Writing Center at CSU. They're very nice people, and they can provide a lot of assistance on different things with writing, research papers. Okay. And your last assignment is this Unit 8 PowerPoint. Okay, so basically you're going to create a PowerPoint presentation. If you've never done a PowerPoint presentation, this is kind of a good opportunity for you to do one, because I'm guarantee probably as you go along further in class or in professional life, you're probably going to have to do a PowerPoint. So this is a pretty easy one to do. Needs to be about 500 words on between 5 to 8 slides. And you need to have at least 2 references, so not a terrible lot of research is required. When you do your citations and references, you're going to want to use the APA style again. And the PowerPoint topic is you're going to select one of these following popular social movements from 19th century American history. You can choose from the women's suffrage movement, the abolition movement to get rid of slavery, the labor movement as far as trying to get unions and things like that, the Grange movement, which was a movement amongst farmers and agricultural producers, the temperance movement to try to get rid of alcohol. Actually, my great grandmother was involved in that, believe it or not. The Republican Party, the movement for public schools, and the movement for prison reform. So again, I would advise you to go through your unit study guide and kind of read that first, but I'm sure one of these will probably be of interest to you. And pick one of them. And then step 2 is start, putting together your presentation. Your introduction and the historical context, probably 3 to 4 slides for that. Okay. And basic stuff. Answer these questions. What was the movement? What was it? Describe it. Maybe you want to narrow in on one particular aspect of it. Maybe if like you choose the labor movement, and maybe you want to talk about just one particular labor union. Talk about the leaders of the movement, what the goals were, how big was it? Was it just in one part of the U.S. or was it all over the country? Did it have anything in common with some of the other movements that talked about there? And was it successful? Did they achieve what they wanted to achieve? That kind of thing. And you're going to want to have at least 3 images of the movement. So maybe some of the leaders or events associated with it or whatever you want to do, but try to get at least 3 images in your PowerPoint. And then use the next couple slides to do a contemporary assessment and write a paragraph about 250 words on discussing whether or not the movement reached its goals in the 21st century. And if they did, how come? What did they do that made it happen for them? And if they didn't, why didn't they, do you think? Okay. On the last slide is where you should put your citations and your references. And there's an example here how to cite if you have a picture or whatever you want to put on there. Okay. So it's not too difficult of an assignment. It's kind of fun actually. And you can choose, some different pictures and stuff. So that's your last assignment for the class. Okay. Anybody have any questions before I get into the content stuff for the lecture tonight on any of those that I talked about with these last 2 assignments? They're pretty straightforward. But if you have anything that you need to talk about, you can ask, now, or you can ask at the end of the time here where you'll have some time to ask questions, or you can email me too. So
I have a question. Do we have to put footnotes in our?
Somebody's got a question.
This is Will Brown. I'm calling. I'm saying that do we have to have footnotes in our
in the Unit 7 or the Unit 8?
Unit 8.
You do not need to.
Okay.
No. Nope, just put your references in the last slide. That'll be fine.
Copy that. Thank you.
Yep. Anybody else? Okay. I don't like to cut you off if you have any questions. That's kind of what I'm here for. Uh, Pictures. Yeah, you'll need to kind of say where the pictures came from. You can put that in your citation at the end of the PowerPoint. Just kind of make it, just a, sort of a general citation where you got the image. That's just kind of a good practice to get into for any kind of academic presentation or anything too. Anybody else? Okay, I'm going to move forward here. So what I'm going to do tonight, I know we're past this in the class as far as where we're at with the timeline, but I want to go backwards a little bit just to give you a little more information. I think it's important to fill in some of the gaps and just kind of give you guys your money's worth and talk a little bit more about the Revolutionary War and some of the things that were kind of important involving that, just to kind of fill in some of the information. So I want to talk about one political idea, one political party, and one economic idea that all had kind of an important causative factor, kind of an important connection to the American Revolution. Okay. So the political idea is called republicanism. Okay, and this has not anything to do with the Republican Party of today, totally different. So republicanism became a very popular idea. It came out of the Enlightenment period in European history. And it focused on the idea that citizens of a nation had a really high responsibility for the civic virtue of that nation. In other words, the citizens had a responsibility, according to this idea, to be involved in the governing of their nation, to get involved in public service, get involved in government. Think like John F. Kennedy, his famous quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," that kind of thing. That's kind of the general idea. And that as a citizen, you needed to kind of subordinate your own interests for the good of the country. Does somebody have a question? Okay. And the other thing with republicanism, as far as it's connected to the revolution, is very much opposed to aristocracy and monarchy. Okay, so in other words, they didn't like the idea that anybody should feel like they were better than somebody else or that they should inherit their title or whatever. And of course, that's going to be directly against the British, because the British, their entire system of government was based upon aristocracy and heredity and all those kinds of things. And probably, I would say 100% of the American founders were really big proponents of republicanism. Okay? The political party is the Whig Party in England. This is the British political party in the British Parliament. And there's a branch of the Whig Party called the Radical Whigs. There weren't very many of them, but they were very supportive of the Americans. They believed that the colonists had a firm case. They thought that the colonists should be given more rights. They even thought the colonists should probably get some representatives in Parliament to represent them. And all through the Revolutionary War, this radical Whig part of the Whig Party tried to help the colonists. They tried to kind of argue the colonist case in Parliament. So they're kind of an ally of the Americans. And the economic idea that's important to understand for the revolution is something called mercantilism. Okay, so mercantilism has, it's not really around anymore. It kind of died out at the end of the 19th century, but it was really popular for a while there. And the basis of mercantilism is measuring the power of a country by the amount of silver and gold that country has been able to stockpile. So if you're a mercantilist and you're in charge of a country, you're going to try to put policies in place where you can sell a lot more stuff than you buy. And you can accumulate silver and gold, get it in your treasury, and that's basically how you'd measure your power. Well, the British government was very mercantilist, and they put in place policies that would enable them to export a lot more stuff. In other words, sell a lot more stuff than they imported. And they basically saw their colonies in the Americas as a sure market, a guaranteed market for all their British produced goods. So they put in place a whole bunch of various policies to maximize the amount of goods that the colonists basically were forced to buy from England. They put shipping laws in place. One was called the Navigation Law. And basically, this law said that any commerce that's going to or from these American colonies had to travel on British flag ships. So if you're like a merchant in Boston and you're trying to sell stuff, say, to Germany, and you get a better deal, you can transport your stuff on a German ship for cheaper. Can't do that. It's illegal. You have to use a British flag ship. And of course, that raised revenues for Great Britain, right? Because now all the commerce had to go on British ships. And the reverse was also true. If any European companies or markets wanted to try to ship stuff to America, the navigation laws said that first the ships had to stop in England, had to be unloaded, and then the British would tax those goods before they could be sent over to America. So what happened then? Basically, it made any kind of products from any country besides England more expensive. So it was another way for the British to try to basically force the colonists to only buy British goods. Okay. Some products that were produced in the Americas were restricted by British law to only be sold in England, like tobacco. Even if you're a tobacco producer and you got a better deal to sell someplace else, you weren't allowed to. You had to sell it to the English. So as all these policies are put in place, this basically all dealing with mercantilism, currency, gold and silver, begins to drain out of the colonies because the British are hoarding it. So it became very difficult for colonial business people to do business. Colonial administrations tried to print paper money, but the British said you can't do that. They wouldn't let colonial merchants file for bankruptcy because they said that was hurting British merchants. So all those things were part of the mercantilist agenda, and they all harmed colonial merchants and colonial consumers. The other big thing that's going on that's important to understand too is the British had just concluded this war called the 7 Years' War with France. And Britain was victorious. They pretty much kicked France out of North America as a result of this war. But it had been very expensive. And the British finished up the war with about 140 million pounds in debt. That'd be probably, close to several billion today. So, it was a serious amount of money. And they were trying to figure out a way, how can we raise this money? How can we, get rid of this debt? And the proposal was made that during the 7 Years' War, the British military had defended the colonies, so now the colonies owed Britain, and it was decided to put taxes on the colonies as a primary way to make up this indebtedness. So British Parliament began to pass a number of new laws to increase revenue, increase taxes on the colonies. They increased taxes on sugar. They passed laws to basically more strictly enforce those navigation acts. They passed a law called the Quartering Act, which was really hated by the colonists, which basically said that the British military could come to your house and they could require you to basically house and feed British soldiers. You wouldn't have any say in it at all. They just come to your house and say, hey, we're going to put 5 soldiers in your house. You're going to take care of them. There's also something called the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act was just a strict up tax on any kind of official document that a colonial person might need if you tried to get a marriage license, if you tried to uh, open a business, get some kind of a license for that, um, change property, needed a deed, whatever, any kind of official document you had to have stamped, and you had to pay a tax on it. And if you would refuse to do any of these things, if you refuse to pay the taxes, you could be brought up on charges and you would be tried in what were called admiralty courts, be the equivalent of a military court today. Um, there were no judges, there were British admirals who oversaw the courts. Burden of proof was on the defendants. So you basically came to court already being assumed that you're guilty unless you could prove you're innocent. And if you were convicted in one of these courts, you could be taken away from your home in the colonies. You could actually end up doing prison time in England or some of the British colonies. So this was really seen by the colonists as just kind of really a major violation of their rights. And this begins, I know you've heard this phrase before, but this begins this phrase you begin to hear in the colonies: no taxation without representation. In other words, the colonists wanted to have somebody from the colonies represent them in Parliament in England, so they had a say in all this. And the British refused. They absolutely refused to make any kind of a compromise on that. So the colonies began to organize. Initially, they sent delegates from all the different colonies to a meeting to talk about the Stamp Act and ways to try to deal with it. And one of the things they decided to do is to basically begin a boycott of imported things from Britain. They wouldn't buy stuff from Britain anymore. So this got to be very popular. Lots of people refused to do business with any kind of British, companies. Tax collectors who worked for the British government were harassed, driven out of town, and eventually Parliament in England was put under pressure by the British citizens, who a lot of them had lost their jobs in factories because they weren't selling stuff anymore to the colonies. Factories laid people off. Those people contacted their representatives in Parliament, and eventually Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. And it looked for a short time that maybe there might be a compromise. Maybe the colonists would be able to get the British Parliament to compromise, but it didn't materialize. Shortly after they repealed the Stamp Act, they put in place a whole bunch of new taxes called the Townshend Acts, and these were on all kinds of different things. All kinds of stuff that they imported from England: glass, lead, paper, paint. Probably the big one was tea. That really irritated the colonists, because tea was just something that everybody drank during that time. And there began to be a lot of resentment, more than there had been against the British. There were protests, and at one of these protests, violence occurred. The British had sent more soldiers into the colonies, particularly into Massachusetts, to enforce all these new laws. And in Boston, in March of 1770, there was a confrontation. And depending on whether or not you believe the British version of events or the colonial version of events, sort of different. The British said that their soldiers were attacked by a violent mob. The colonists said the only thing the mob did was throw snowballs and say mean things to the British soldiers. But what we do know is the British soldiers opened fire, and they killed 11 residents of Boston, and it's called the Boston Massacre. And some people say that was kind of the beginning, in some ways, of the Revolutionary War. Okay? So there's more and more resentment in the colonies over these taxes. And then the colonists found out more about the British tea tax. So most of the tea that the English used and sold was grown in India. The way that the British ran their colonies in India, there was a British company. It's called a crown company, because the British monarchy actually kind of controlled it. It's called the British East India Company, and they were in bad trouble financially. So the British Parliament decided, why don't we give them the exclusive right to import tea into the American colonies? and that would save them from bankruptcy. Um, Also, by the way, there were a number of British members of Parliament who had stock in the British East India Company, and they would make a lot of money on this policy. And the American colonists found out about this, and they were just furious. They saw this as a really corrupt thing, trying to profit the British government. And this led to the famous Boston Tea Party. A number of these American colonists who were opposed to this tea tax got onto British ships that were anchored in Boston Harbor with tea on them, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. And this was the last straw for the British Parliament. Great Britain now imposed military law on the colonies. They sent more soldiers in. It's kind of the end of any kind of an opportunity, if there even had been one, to try to compromise. And the colonies decided they needed to meet again. So they had another meeting. They called this meeting the first meeting of the Continental Congress. And as they were having this meeting, trying to discuss what they were going to do about all this, the military law and those kind of things, the British military found out that the American colonists had stockpiled muskets and ammunition, black powder at a couple different places, Lexington and Concord. So they sent British troops to those places to seize those arm caches. And at Lexington, they were met by colonial militiamen. Gunfire was exchanged, and the British ended up killing 8 American colonial militiamen. But as they marched to Concord, the American militiamen changed their tactics. A lot of these guys had served in the French and Indian War, and they had observed how the Indians fought. They fought from cover, they fought from ambush, those kind of things. So that's what they did. They harried and ambushed the British soldiers all the way to Concord, and over the course of that march, they ended up killing 300 British soldiers, which back then was an enormous number of killed in a combat situation. And that was kind of the end of any chance for compromise. When the British lost that many soldiers, to violence, there wasn't going to be any more compromise. And if you looked at the odds, it didn't look really good for the colonists. The British Empire was up to that point was the greatest empire in the history of the world. They didn't have the biggest army, but they had one of the best armies in the world, one of the most professionally trained armies in the world. They had the biggest navy. So militarily speaking, it didn't look, very good for the Americans. But on their behalf, or on their side of things, they did have a couple of advantages. One was that the distance between England and the colonies was very great. It would take weeks for a ship to get from London to the colonies, so it took a long time for the British to reinforce their military, to bring supplies, to get orders back and forth. And the other thing was the war was fought basically, in their land. They knew all of it. They knew all the roads and all the back roads and all the rivers and everything, so they were very familiar with the geography. And that turned out to be a huge advantage. So, since nobody had a cell phone at the Boston Tea Party, this is an artist rendition of what it may have looked like. The American colonists dressed up as Mohawk Indians. They went out in the harbor and chopped up these casks of tea. And this is actually one of 2 surviving boxes. It's in a museum in Boston. You can go see it. What they basically transported the tea. And this was actually one of them that was thrown into Boston Harbor. Pretty amazing they still have it. But that's the Boston Tea Party. So the Continental Congress decides to have another meeting in May of 1775. And at this meeting, probably the big decision, the most important decision they made was the creation of an army. Up to this point, they had just been using colonial militias, but now they decided we're going to have to have basically a continental military. So they voted to create an army. They selected one of the members from Virginia, George Washington, to be the commander of the army. He had military experience from the French and Indian War. Um, he turned out to be kind of an inspired choice. He wasn't, a particularly great military genius, but he was kind of one of those rare figures that you find in history who had just a lot of charisma, and people rallied to him. So he was able to inspire a lot of loyalty amongst his men. And that turned out to be more important probably than being a military genius. Because what happened basically for the first year or so of the war was the American army got beat. They retreated many times. The British defeated them in various battles. And Washington basically had to try to keep his army from disintegrating. He had to hold them together, had to keep them from deserting. Basically, that's what he was able to do. And he turned out to be, like I say, an inspired choice to do that. As this goes on, eventually the Continental Congress, the Continental Government, decides that they're going to have to declare independence from England. They'd been fighting this war for a while without doing that. But they decided they needed to make basically a declaration to the world as to why this was happening and why they thought they had the right to do this. Because basically it was an act of treason. The colonies are revolting against their mother country. So they had to find basically some kind of a justification for this. They selected a young lawyer named Thomas Jefferson. He was only 33 years old. You can imagine that. And he was given the task of writing this up basically in a legal document and explaining to the world why it was okay for these colonies to revolt against England. So Jefferson was a very well-educated fellow. He had studied a lot of philosophy and government history and things like that. And the basic argument that he makes in this document is that the people's rights as human beings are not given to them by governments. They're given to them by God. And if you don't believe in God, they're given to them just by the fact that they're human beings, by natural law. If that's true, then governments don't have the right to infringe on those rights. Governments don't have the right to take them away. And that was basically the argument that Jefferson made. He said the British government is trying to take these rights away from us. He called them inalienable rights. He said they don't have the authority to do that. And we have a responsibility as human beings to resist when people try to take away our rights like that. And that was basically the gist of his argument. And of course, that becomes the Declaration of Independence, introduced on July 2nd, 1776. And of course, it was approved July 4th, 1776. Of course, that's why tomorrow's such an important day. And that was basically a public document to show the world why we were rebelling against England, why it was okay for us to do that. So the war goes on, and it's fairly one-sided for a long time. And what really begins to shift the balance in the Revolutionary War, the American government had been trying for a while to get the French to come into the war on their side. They had Benjamin Franklin in Paris, kind of whining and dining and trying to get the French, and eventually they're successful. The French agreed to enter into the war as a full ally of the Americans, and that changes everything. Up to this point, it had kind of almost been like a guerrilla war. The British were fighting. Now they had a major European enemy who had come into the fight. The French sent a big army, a big navy over to America. And that basically, tipped the balance. And after that, for a while, the British tried to fight on, but they were outnumbered. It was too much effort, and eventually they were forced to sue for peace. And the British and Americans signed what was called the Treaty of Paris, 1783, and that ended the Revolutionary War. So now there's this new country that's just been created, and one of the first things they have to figure out is what kind of a government are we going to put in place in this new country. and they just got through the Revolutionary War. They just fought a country that was a monarchy, basically trying to be a dictator to them. So they were very wary of having a really strong federal government. Initially, they tried to create a very weak federal government and left almost all the power and control to the individual states. And they called this the Articles of Confederation. Best way I can describe this to you would be like a club. If we were all members of a club, and you could join the club, you could leave the club. There was no way for the club to raise money. There was no taxation law, so the federal government didn't have any way to raise revenue. All the taxes were done by states, and it was very weak. The federal government didn't have very much power, and what ends up happening is there are a lot of veterans of the Revolutionary War, and a lot of them had been farmers. And when they were off fighting the war, they weren't on their farm, and as a result, a lot of them lost their farms. So there's a whole bunch of these people. They're angry. They feel like the government should pay them back for the loss of their farms and things like that. And they organize themselves into kind of a mob, and they basically try to get the federal government's attention to their grievances. The Continental Congress is able to disperse them with colonial militias, but it really scares them. It scares the Congress. This was basically just a bunch of ticked off farmers. What happens if the British decide to come back and reopen hostilities? What if we get into a war with Spain or some other country? We're going to have a way to have a military. So this led the Congress to decide to try to have a convention to basically redraw the plan of government for this new country. And they met in Philadelphia in May of 1787. They met for that whole summer, and they called this the Constitutional Convention. All the colonies sent delegates to this convention, and basically they were instructed to create a new system of government that would be an improvement from the Articles of Confederation. And they worked all through that summer. They were so worried about spies watching what they were doing. They worked with all the windows shut in a really hot summer, if you can imagine that. And you knew how people dressed back then with 4 and 5 layers of clothes. So I'm sure it was not very pleasant. They studied everything. They studied the Romans. They studied the Greeks. They studied the Germanic tribes. They studied the Celts. All kinds of different things, trying to figure out what kind of government to create. And eventually they came up with 2 competing plans. There was one plan called the Virginia Plan that favored the larger states, and one plan called the New Jersey Plan that favored the smaller states. And it looked for a while that the whole convention would collapse because the larger states and smaller states couldn't agree. And what they eventually basically did is they took a day off. Benjamin Franklin actually encouraged them to take a day off for prayer and reflection. They came back and they came to this compromise called the Great Compromise. And they decided to create a Senate which would have equal representation, and that would be a way that the small states would be satisfied. And they would create a House of Representatives that would be based upon population. And that way the large states would be satisfied. So that was the way they got out of this, this deadlock. They created this new government based upon that. Other things were involved in this too. They created a federal judiciary. They created the Electoral College for the election of the president. The other big issue that was not dealt with at this convention was slavery. There had been discussion, even back at this time, there were people that were opposed to slavery. There had been discussion of trying to abolish slavery. They didn't do it because they were afraid if they tried to do that, it would alienate the southern states and they would leave this new country. So basically what happened is they postponed the Civil War by just about 100 years. That's basically what happens. What they compromise and decide to do is they decide to count slaves as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. So if slaveholding states, they could count their slaves as 3/5 of a person. And that was the beginning, basically, of how black people were viewed in our country as 3/5 of a person. So that's not a real promising start. Um, and of course, you guys have already done this in class. There was a debate between the Federalists who were in favor of this new Constitution and the anti-Federalists who were opposed to it, and they debated back and forth. And they wrote the Federalist Papers, basically as kind of a debate about it. And eventually, the Federalists won. They got enough states to ratify it, and this becomes basically the new basis for the new government. And once the Constitution is ratified and they kind of get the new government, kind of on its feet and get it rolling, other issues kind of come up, issues about debt and the federal banking system. Probably the big one, though, is westward expansion. America began basically as a country that wanted to expand, and more immigrants begin to come in. And one of the things that comes up pretty quickly as a controversy is these new territories out in the western part of the United States. When they get enough population, they can qualify to apply for statehood. So when they let these new territories come in as states, are they going to come in as a slave state where slavery is going to be allowed, or are they going to come in as a free state where slavery is not allowed? Now, the southern states that basically had slavery were worried that the Senate, which basically was equally divided between slave and non-slave states, if more free states got into the Senate, they would pass a law to abolish slavery, and that'd be the end for their economic system. So what ends up happening is a beginning of political compromises. What they basically do in Congress is when these territories need to come in to the country as states, they wait until there's two of them. And then they would admit them as one as a slave state and one as a free state. So the Missouri Compromise in 1820 begins this. Missouri comes in as a slave state, and to offset that, Maine comes in as a free state. And this kind of begins this process of compromising to try to retain that balance in the Senate between slave and free states. And all this is going on. There's the beginning of opposition, widespread opposition to slavery in the North. The abolitionist movement is picking up speed in the North. And there are a number of Northern politicians who make the argument, including Abraham Lincoln, who make the argument that if slavery is just contained, in other words, if we just find a way to stop it from expanding, eventually it will die off. They argued that economically it wasn't a viable system. Eventually, it wouldn't work anymore because it wasn't profitable. And for a while, that looked like that might be true. And then, lo and behold, there was a new invention that was created. It was called the cotton gin. There was an inventor named Eli Whitney. He's credited with this invention. And basically, it was a very simple kind of a filtration system that you could process cotton and purify it and get it so it was clean and available, and you could sell it. Well, what it did is it made it possible for very small number of people to be able to prepare the cotton, and it made cotton a lot easier to process, and therefore it made it a lot more profitable to grow cotton. So cotton growers, slave owners, now they actually had an increasing demand for more slaves and more land to plant more cotton and make more money. So instead of slavery, looking like it's going to die out, it actually gets a new birth, and more demand for slaves and more demand for land to plant more cotton. Let's see what else I want to say here. Oh, I know. I wanted to show you. This is the cotton gin. It's pretty simple. Eli Whitney got the patent for it, but everybody found out how it worked pretty quickly, and very quickly there were all kinds of knockoffs. People made their own. So pretty soon almost every plantation had one of these. And you just kind of put the cotton in there and turn this thing around, and out comes the clean cotton you can put into bales and sell it. Okay. So slavery becomes even more entrenched in the South. By 1860, there were about 4 million black slaves in America, and almost all of them were in the southern states. Um, and slavery was probably worse than you can imagine. It was horrendous. Um, Slaves were, they were sold. Families were split apart. They had absolutely no rights at all. They could be tortured. They could be killed. They could be raped. Uh, they were not given any education. No rights whatsoever. And slavery had begun as an economic system. I mean, that was kind of the reasoning for it economically. But as time went on, Southern slave owners, it seemed like they needed to have a moral or philosophical justification for slavery. And then you begin to see sort of the racial arguments that begin to kind of come into this. You see in Southern newspapers and Southern writings that black people are considered to be subhuman. They're not considered to sort of be on the same level as whites. And that kind of becomes the argument that Southern slave owners use. We can do whatever we want to these people because they're not really human beings. That kind of becomes the argument. And the abolition movement gets stronger in the North. They begin to print newspapers, pamphlets, books. They try to get those things into the South. The Southerners pass laws to basically stop that from happening. And basically the national tension level just kind of ratchets up year by year. Okay. I didn't want to throw this out there because one of the things you sometimes hear now from some historians, particularly Southern historians still today, is that slavery was not the primary reason for the Civil War. Sometimes you hear this argument, sometimes it's called the lost cause philosophy. And it kind of gained ground in the 1890s. That's when you see basically a lot of those Confederate monuments being put up, the 1890s, early 1900s, as kind of a way to try to honor the South and try to sort of say the South had a right to secede and it wasn't about slavery and so on and so on. So here's a speech from the vice president of the whole shebang, the whole Confederacy, made shortly after the beginning of the Civil War, 1861. His name is Alexander Stephens. I'm just quickly going to read this just to kind of give you a flavor of the philosophy behind the Southern Confederacy. So it says, the new Constitution has put at rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists amongst us, the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. This was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. Jefferson in his forecast had anticipated this as the rock upon which the old Union would split. He was right. What was conjecture with him is now a realized fact. And he kind of goes on, and I want to get to the part that I really want you to hear. He said, those assumptions rested upon the equality of the races. This was an error. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. And there's really no doubt that this was the prevailing attitude of the Southern leadership before the war, during the war, and after the war for a time as well. Okay? So time rolls along, and you get to the 1850s, and there's another one of these political compromises called the Compromise of 1850, and it's the last one of these compromises. Texas gets to come in as a slave state. California comes in as a free state to balance it out. But the southern states also get, within this compromise, a new federal law called the Fugitive Slave Law. And this law was really hated by northern abolitionists. What this law basically said was, no matter how long somebody had been freed from slavery, if they were living in the North, if they were on American soil anywhere, they could be apprehended by a Southern slave hunter. They could be returned to slavery to their former owner. The person that assisted slaves to get to freedom, they could be arrested and put in jail. So this caused a lot of people in the North who had kind of been lukewarm about the abolitionist movement to join them, and it really ratcheted up friction between the North and the South, basically further, destroying any chance of compromise if there really had been a chance of compromise. So what you basically get are these very, very wealthy Southern plantation owners who are kind of controlling the policy of the South. How wealthy do I mean? Um, Here's an example. This is a plantation. I believe this is outside New Orleans. And you can just looking at this picture, you can imagine how much money is involved in something like this. It'd probably be in the trillions of dollars today. The slaves were a primary economic asset of the Southern plantation owners. In fact, there was a study done that showed that the value of the slaves was greater than all the rest of the personal property of the South combined. So this was a huge economic issue for these Southern plantation owners. Their livelihood, as they saw it, was at stake, and that's probably one of the reasons they were so intent on avoiding any kind of a compromise. And then we get to this fateful Supreme Court decision in 1857. It's called the Dred Scott decision. This is one of the topics you can choose to write on for your Unit 7 paper. So Dred Scott was an enslaved man, and he found a way, which I think is amazing. He found a way to hire a lawyer and make his case, and his case was very simple. He basically said that he and his owner had been living in a free state for 5 years, and since he's living in a free state, why isn't he free? Why is he still a slave? He should be freed. So this case winds its way through the federal court system, ends up at the Supreme Court, and probably unbeknownst to Mr. Scott, he didn't have a chance at the Supreme Court because the majority of justices at the court were slave owners. So there's no way they're going to rule in favor of him. And what they decide basically is they issue a bunch of legal rulings as a result of this case. They're all in the decision. They say it's unconstitutional to try to restrict slavery anywhere. So basically, they invalidate all those previous compromises that have been done to try to patch things up between the North and the South. All those things are considered illegal. So from now on, you can't restrict slavery anywhere. It can be in the North, can be in the South, can be anywhere. They basically reaffirm that slaves have no rights. So this is like the last straw. There's really no way for the politicians to find a way out of this one. This is kind of the end of any chance of compromise. Then you get the federal presidential election of 1860, and it's kind of a mess. There are a number of candidates. One of them is Abraham Lincoln, who is he's not advocating the abolition of slavery, but he is advocating not letting it expand any further at this point in his career. And all the southern states say that if Lincoln wins, they will leave the Union. So, in fact, Lincoln does win, and all these southern states begin the process of passing what are called Articles of Secession, and they begin to leave the Union. And that's probably the most critical crisis our country's ever faced. Lincoln is sworn in as president, and the Civil War begins. And as the war begins, the southern states, the Confederacy has some advantages. The southern military tradition was really great, and it was very common for wealthy, families to send their sons to West Point. So there were a lot of really good southern generals, and initially they were victorious. They did very well, but as the war went on, their major disadvantage began to show up, and that was a lack of manufacturing power. most of the manufacturing might in our country was in the north, in the northern cities. So as the war went on, more and more industrial power came to bear, and the North begins to overpower the South. And over time, the Northern armies, new generals come to the forefront, good generals, uh, General Grant, General Sherman, ruthless generals who will do what they need to do to win. Um, and eventually, of course, the Southerners are defeated, and the war, it has ramifications beyond just the end of the war. The South lost, really a lot of their political power, their sort of their place in the country. They really didn't regain that until the 1950s and 1960s because military bases were created in southern states by southern politicians in Congress, and that really began to bring in new tax revenue and things like that. But that's kind of the end of the Civil War, and I want to stop the sharing. I want to give you guys a chance, if I can get this to work, to ask some questions here. Okay. Anybody have any questions on any of the content stuff I talked about, or the assignments, or anything that I can answer at all? I'll tell you what, I'm going to stick around here in case anybody has any questions. And if you don't have any questions, you guys are free to take off. I hope you guys have a great 4th of July. Don't blow your fingers off with a firecracker. And I'll just hang out here for a while if anybody has any questions.